Is that on? Okay. Can you all hear me? Is this working? Louder, louder? No? Good. All right. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're going to start shutting that down so we can be here in this space. There might be some people straggling in. We had almost 60 people signed up for in-person. Maybe the weather got to them, but we might have some people. So there's also some folks who are streaming in online. But yeah, thank you for taking a beautiful evening and coming to spend it with us talking about water. My name is Kate Fitzpatrick. I'm the Executive Director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. I'll say a few words about our organization, and then I will introduce our speakers for the evening. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors for this session of the Raise the Deschutes seminar series. We have Open Space, this lovely venue that you're sitting in. We have Hand in Hand that's doing the live streaming and video recording of our evening tonight. So if you have friends who want to catch it afterwards, it's available. And Lisa will tell you about that at the end, how to access that. We also have Sunrise Rotary of Bend is sponsoring this session. So we're also looking for more sponsors for our future Raise the Deschutes series. So if you have a business or an entity that thinks water's important, get in touch with us and we can get your name up here and help you sponsor some events. So the Deschutes River Conservancy, I'm just going to step back. We were formed back in 1996. Just kind of a show of hands is who's heard of the DRC before tonight or familiar with our work? Okay, looks like about 2/3, 1/3. And then how many people have moved here in like the last year? All right, excellent. This is awesome that you come in and you want to learn about water right away. So the DRC was founded in 1996, and it was a very unique situation where the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation got together with irrigation interests and environmental interests and said, what are the biggest issues coming down the pipe that we're going to want to deal with ahead of time to avoid conflict? And water went immediately to the top of that list. You look around the West, and there's conflict everywhere around water. So, hi, BJ. So they decided to form an organization with a mission to restore stream flow and water quality, but to do it in a collaborative way using consensus in the community. So we were authorized with a 15-person board of directors that represents all the major interests around water: irrigation, agriculture, environment, hydropower, and agencies, all working together to get ahead of these issues and try to do projects that meet water needs and restore rivers without hurting any aspect of the community. So we've been doing that work for 26 years, and we've been very successful. I think we've restored more flow than any other basin in the West using collaboration, and we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, which is what you're going to hear about starting tonight, but we feel confident that if we continue to work together, we can get there. So one of the things that doing our work we've noticed is that, everybody relies on the river and relies on water, whether it's for recreation, spiritual fulfillment, aesthetics, irrigation, drinking water. We all need the river. What's also equally true is that water is really complex. And so we have so many people that say, I care about these issues, I want to get involved. And we start talking and we go down rabbit holes and it gets into water rights, and it's just hard to know how to engage with that. So we concocted this Raise the Deschutes seminar series as one of our attempts to really make water accessible to everybody who lives here. So how do we raise the water IQ, Water 101 for people in the basin? So A, you know what the issues are, and B, you know how to engage and support the solutions, and also add your voice to the table to bring forth maybe new solutions or new perspectives that we haven't thought of. So if you're just getting here, welcome. So tonight is the first session of our series. It's the highest level, hydrology and water management in the upper Deschutes Basin. This should give you the foundation to understand, what the issues are, from which you can then start to understand how can we solve this problem together. I also want to pause. I mentioned that we were founded by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. That's actually the Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute tribes. And we always like to acknowledge that history at the beginning of water events. So we honor the Native people who have called this region home for thousands of years. We join them in stewardship of our rivers for the next 7 generations. So tonight we have 2 excellent presenters. Lisa Seals is a programs manager at the Deschutes River Conservancy. She has a PhD basically in water in the Deschutes, literally. And we have Jonathan LaMarche with the Oregon Water Resources Department. I'm going to let Lisa introduce him more completely in a minute. So how this is going to work is we're going to have a conversation. Lisa and Jonathan are going to have a conversation, and I believe they're going to invite questions and discussion as we go. Any questions? Okay, again, thank you for being here tonight.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure. I know it's a really nice night outside, so it's tempting to be outside instead of inside. But for those of you that are at home, it's really cool here. So if you're at home sweating it out, we wish that you were here sharing this time with us. So yeah, thank you all for coming. This is our very first Raise the Deschutes seminar. So you all are our guinea pigs. So we are depending on you to help us better understand going forward what works and what doesn't work. This whole conversation process that we're trying. Jonathan and I are used to standing in front of a PowerPoint like, you know, teachers in a classroom and doing things that way. And so we're trying things a little differently. So we're looking forward to getting your feedback on what works and what doesn't work. And we really do want this to be interactive. So to the best of your ability, like, please stop us, like raise your hand and interrupt us if we are all of a sudden starting to like revert to wonky water talk, which we will both do undoubtedly because it is inevitable. So I'm counting on all of you, all of your faces in the audience, and even some of you at home, if you guys want, you can use the chat box to ask questions and stop us, and we'll clarify things. Because at this point, we're really trying to start super high level, and as Kate described, we've designed an entire series to kind of delve into the different projects and programs and groups and partnerships that are working in the basin to try to solve the issues that we're going to just start talking about tonight. So that's basically how it's going to go. And yeah, so I want to be, I'm eternally grateful to Jonathan LaMarche here, who is a hydrologist for the Oregon Water Resources Department, which is affectionately known as OWRD. There are so many acronyms in water world, and I will undoubtedly use them. So Jonathan works for the Oregon Water Resources Department, and he has been working for the department in his position for 24 years. So he is definitely an expert on the topic, and really very few people know as much as he does about hydrology, which we're going to talk about what that is in just a second. He predominantly focuses his work on the eastern Cascades, so exactly where we are today. So he's worked on basin studies on the eastern side of the Cascades all over the state. So thank you for being the guinea pig and being here with me today. Yeah, so with that, Jonathan, you're a hydrologist. Tell us, what does that even mean? Tell us, what is hydrology?
Right. So like Lisa was saying, we're trying to make this more interactive, and this is definitely stepping out of the box of what I'm used to. So hopefully this will go well. But we thought we'd start off by just talking about what hydrology means. So, you know, it's a term that you've probably heard, but you might not really be familiar with. And basically what it is, it's the study of how water moves across, over and through the landscape, right? And as hydrologists, we try to quantify that and understand how things vary spatially and temporally. So, you know, how does water resources change with different climate? How does groundwater move through the system? How does surface water interact with groundwater? How much water does crops use? And so that's the study of hydrology. And when we're talking about the hydrology of the upper Deschutes Basin, we're trying to give you a basic understanding of the water resources, right? Of the surface water, of the groundwater. So when you go to other presentations or other seminars or discussions or collaborative groups, that you have a basis of understanding. So that's what we're going to cover today.
Great, thank you. So if there aren't any questions, we'll dive into an orientation of the Deschutes Basin. So this is just a slide that shows everybody essentially the Columbia Basin. The larger, darker area is the entire Columbia Basin, and that little yellow area, it looks little, it's not really that little, it's actually 10,000 square miles, or more than 10,000 square miles, is a tributary. The Deschutes is a tributary to the Columbia. It's a tributary to the lower Columbia, I believe. And so diving in a little bit deeper here, so there is the Deschutes Basin relative to the state of Oregon. For those of you that aren't aware, it's actually the second largest river basin in the state after the Willamette Basin, which is found to the west. And actually, this is something Jonathan asked me earlier. Do those of you all understand the idea of what a basin is? Like when we start talking about basins, do most people understand that? Okay, I'm seeing noddings of heads, but essentially, okay, I'm also somebody's waving and saying no. So a basin effectively is an area of land where all the water that falls in that particular area sort of drains to one specific river. So the way I think about it, I like to think about it sort of the analogy of a tree. If you think about all of the little branches and things in a tree and how ultimately that all leads to the major trunk of the tree, that's essentially sort of how a river basin works. So in our case, it's sort of from ridgeline to ridgeline of the geographic boundary of, in this case, Oregon. So all the water that's falling on the Cascades and draining to the west would be draining into what is the Willamette Basin. And all the water that is effectively falling on the Cascades and draining to the east is falling in the Deschutes Basin. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so I'll keep throwing, and I will also say that people like to use the term watershed, basin, drainage basin. They're all kind of used interchangeably. So yeah, so what we're looking at here is the Deschutes Basin, the second largest basin in the state. Our river, I feel like people, including myself, have a hard time with this. The river flows north, which is like a very simple thing, but it's kind of complicated too. So the headwaters actually are in the south of this map, and the river is running 252 miles north to its confluence. The confluence is basically where it joins another river. That's the tributary part. So it joins the confluence of the Columbia, 252 miles north. So it's also really interesting because it is incredibly steep. I love this little factoid. It drops over 4,500 feet over its 252 miles, okay? In comparison to the Columbia, which again was that huge area that drains Canada and a bunch of western states, that river is 1,200 miles long, and it only drops 2,700 feet. So we've got a really sort of steep topography, which is one of the many ways that makes the Deschutes unique. So I have a question for the audience. We're going to try to engage you with some questions from time to time. So my question for the audience is, does anyone know which body of water is considered the headwaters of the Deschutes River? Ooh, I see an answer in the crowd. Very close. Little Lava Lake, very good. Yes, Little Lava Lake. Yeah, and it's really interesting because we're going to talk, Jonathan's going to cover this explicitly throughout the presentation, but Little Lava Lake is the first place where the Deschutes River becomes continuous surface water, right? But realistically, we're going to talk about the real headwaters of the Deschutes are the Cascades. So we're gonna get into that in just a second. So moving along. So here's another little graphic, just shows the Deschutes River with some of the features that you guys may or may not be familiar with. You guys are probably familiar with Bend and Redmond that are on the maps, and Madras and Maupin. But you can see also you've got Wickiup Reservoir and Crane Prairie and Little Lava, which is not labeled on the map but is the headwaters. And before we go into kind of the coloring and the border on this map, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you often hear people talk about, like for instance, this talk was labeled the hydrology and water management of the upper Deschutes. So we always throw in these terms around upper Deschutes, middle Deschutes, lower Deschutes. Does anyone know what the upper Deschutes, what that section of river is, or where? Above. That is it, what's in this picture, but we actually, the upper is from Bend, upriver, so going south, which is super confusing again. Bend upriver is the upper Deschutes, and then exactly what you said from the dam from Lake Billy Chinook to Bend is considered the middle Deschutes, and then the area below Lake Billy Chinook is the lower Deschutes. So, yes. Question.
Which is extra confusing. I just wanted to clarify. So Upper Deschutes Basin, that would be a correct answer.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and
Actually,
we're getting there.
Yeah. You are correct in terms.
Yes. Yes. We had a correction from the back. For those of you that are online, I just want to let you all know that Kate clarified that the answer was correct in the audience, and that we're going to talk about the Upper Deschutes Basin, which actually I'm passing it on to Jonathan to talk about the Upper Deschutes
Right.
Basin. So it gets complicated, but I just wanted to sort of denote that those are the different reaches for you all, because
Right.
people are going to throw those terms around, and now hopefully you'll have a better understanding of where people are talking about when they start talking about that.
Right. So what Lisa was referring to, as she explained, was the reaches, right? And do you all, are you familiar with that term? What a reach is? It's basically just a segment of river. So Lisa accurately described the upper reach of the Deschutes, the middle reach, and then the lower reach. But in terms of the basin, we typically define it as the Upper Deschutes Basin, which, as you indicated, is above, the Pelton Round Butte or Lake Billy Chinook area, and includes all of the drainage, again, all of the waters that drain to that point. So everything that you see highlighted in yellow there. And then the lower Deschutes is below that. And one of the reasons that that's the delineation point is that if you go down to that lower river, you will see a very remarkable, very substantial river whose flow really doesn't vary all that much. It's a great place to go fishing. It's a great place to go recreating. You don't see a lot of issues in terms of flow there, and you don't see a lot of water use there either. Again, below the Pelton Round Butte Dam complex. Upstream of that, however, things are different. Water is used quite extensively for agriculture. There's storage reservoirs in Wickiup and Crane Prairie. And the hydrologic or the stream flow issues are present in the Upper Deschutes. We have areas where we have extremely low stream flows in different parts of the year, either through storage or because of diversions and whatnot. And the area that is defined in black there is kind of a subset of the Upper Deschutes Basin that is studied quite extensively. And it's what we call the Upper Deschutes study area. And what I'm referring to is that there's been a series of hydrologic investigations by the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, and ourselves in this area. And the reason that specifically is of interest is the hydrologic characteristics of that area are very unique. The Upper Crooked, which has kind of been left out in the cold there in terms of this map, the hydrology of that area is markedly different from the area that's outlined in black. As a matter of fact, the stream flow that you see down at the mouth of the Deschutes near the Columbia confluence, most of that actually originates from the area outlined in black, and the challenges and the resource of that area are quite distinct from elsewhere in the basin.
Yeah, which we're going to tell you all about in the next few minutes. So our next map, we have another audience participation question for you all.
Right. So this is kind of our first introduction to what makes the hydrology, our first indication really of what maybe makes the hydrology unique. And do you guys, so this is, I should explain, this is a stream network map of Oregon, right? And does anybody notice anything distinct about the Deschutes area?
This is all the surface water in the state of Oregon.
There's a big hole there.
Yep.
Right. And there's not a lot of surface water features there. There's just not. And what's even more remarkable, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is that even though Bend and Redmond and Prineville area is arid, and the basin kind of has this stereotype of being an arid basin, there's actually quite a bit of precipitation that falls in the Cascades. So that gives us the first indication that something is distinct about the Deschutes.
Yeah. Does anybody have any guesses as to why there's a big hole in the middle of the state and why there isn't a whole lot of surface water? We are going to answer this question throughout the presentation, but I was just curious if anybody... Lava, yes. Volcanoes, yes. Very unique part of the state.
I think we have some candidates for the next talk.
I know, exactly. We're recruiting you all. All right. Yeah, go right ahead.
Going back to the lower Deschutes, I'm curious, prior to the dam at Lake Billy Chinook, you said that the volume or the level of that river doesn't change much. What did it do previous to that?
I'm going to repeat the question for the folks in the audience, online. The question is, prior to the dams, we're curious what the flows in the lower Deschutes were like, especially at Lake Billy Chinook. So that's for the folks at home.
Yeah. So if by the reservoirs you're talking about the upper ones, the ones that we use for irrigation, right? No. Well, Lake Billy Chinook, Pelton, Round Butte, those are more run of the river type dams. So those don't affect stream flow as much as you would think. But there is some effect from the upper reservoirs because they're storing water, and we'll get into that in a moment. Good question. That's a great question.
Which we are hopefully.
I know we're talking about the upper.
Yeah, we're hopefully we will also answer that question, and if we don't, we'll come back around to it. Okay. All right. So again.
Right. So there's our outline of our basin from our study area, and as we indicated, there's not a lot of streams there.
Yes. So the Deschutes is very unique.
Right. And so the uniqueness of the Deschutes River has been observed from the early 1900s. And this is a great quote from a couple of investigators that were looking at utilizing the Deschutes and allocating water for things that we'll talk about in a moment. But maybe I'll just describe first what this is. This is what we call a hydrograph. This is a mean monthly hydrograph. So this is what you'd expect to see, the average flow conditions, and how it varies seasonally, right? And it starts in October, which might seem kind of strange, and it's because October is the start of what we call our water year. Does anyone know why that might be the start of our water year?
Yep.
Right, exact. Those are great. Those are great answers. It's kind of the end of the dry season. It's the end of irrigation. It's when that we start to get some of those storms that come in, and so and that's when we typically start accumulating water in reservoirs and also even the snowpack. So those are great answers. And so at any rate, this graph just basically shows a very uniform hydrograph, and for a river this size, it is truly remarkable. As a matter of fact, I think it's the largest river that exhibits these traits in the United States. And let's see, what else?
Well, so how many people have come from places where they're used to rivers like, getting really big after a heavy rain or a snow melt, and then I know a lot of people are from other areas outside of Bend, or new to Bend, I should say. So yeah, that's what I always think about. I grew up on the west side of the Cascades, and we would get a heavy rain event, and the rivers would just be in flood stage, and they would be running brown, and it was like an immediate reaction to that rain event. And that is not what we find in the Deschutes Basin. So the hydrograph is naturally occurring, so incredibly stable.
Right, and the other thing to point out is not all the basin exhibits these traits, but the main stem Deschutes does, and so if we looked at the Little Deschutes with one of the tributaries, it has more of that response that Lisa spoke about, more of that response to precipitation, especially rainfall events. There's actually quite a bit of snow accumulation there, and then Tumalo Creek and White Juice Creek also kind of exhibit some of those characteristics, but not near as much as what you'd see in the Crooked. Which is, again, why the Crooked is kind of outside of the study area. The Crooked is very flashy. It has extremely high flows to rainfall events. The response is quick. And then after the rain event is over, the decline in flow is equally quick. And so again, this speaks to some of the uniqueness of the hydrologic setting of the Deschutes.
All right. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about climate. I know climate plays a huge role in all of this as well. So let's talk about the climate in the area.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. So again, we think of the Deschutes Basin as being arid, right? And actually, in terms of the Cascades, it actually, we get quite a bit of precipitation. As a matter of fact, in some places over 200 inches. So this is a map that shows how the spatial distribution of precipitation over the basin. And again, in the center parts of the basin, you can see those are the lighter colors, which show around the Redmond area, the Bend area, we're talking maybe 10 to 20 inches of precipitation a year. And up on the Cascades, the eastern flanks of the Cascades, upwards of 80, and again, in some places over 200 inches. And the reason for that is that the Cascade Mountains are intercepting these moisture-laden air masses off the Pacific. And when they hit the Cascades, they start to dump that precipitation. And a lot of that falls on the west side, but quite a good amount falls on the east side, and mostly in the form of snow. And the thing about the snow is that it acts as nature's natural reservoir, right? So it's kind of another reservoir, if you will, accumulating that during the winter seasons, and then when it melts, a good amount of that starts to enter into the system. So go ahead.
Oh, we have a question in the audience.
So is an inch of snow equal to an inch of rain?
I'm going to repeat the question for the audience at home. Is an inch of rain the same as an inch of snow, or is an inch of snow the same as an inch of rain?
That's a great question, and no, it's not. So when I'm talking about precipitation, I am talking about basically the equivalent of inches of rainfall. So it's usually, it depends on how wet the snow is, but it's usually like 10 to 1. So you can get quite a bit of snowpack. So when I say 120 inches of rain, 120 inches of precipitation, basically I'm talking about 12 feet, the equivalent of 12 feet of rain falling on parts of the Cascades.
In the form of snow.
In the form of snow. So it actually be even taller than that. So
Yes. All
great
right.
question. Thanks.
Did you have anything else to add, or was I know I interrupted you with the question.
I think that's it.
Okay. Oh yeah, another question from the audience.
Are these amounts based on previous years? You're saying 9 to 20 inches for Bend. When's the last time we had that?
That's it.
I'm going to repeat the question. I'm sorry for the people at home. The question was whether or not these were current measurements, or what the current situation is.
So this is a 30-year average, and this particular graph, I believe, was from a 2003 report. So the average would have been probably 1971 through 2000. But at least the spatial distribution of precipitation, you wouldn't expect to change. But you are correct in that climate obviously changes, and year-to-year variation there is quite a bit. But you would still kind of expect this pattern.
And we're going to talk more about that too. So I love it. You're one step ahead of us. All right. So let's talk a little bit about geology and how the geology. Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And that's it.
That was not supposed to happen. Oh, God. What's happening? I know. Let's go back. Okay.
Okay.
Here we go. Sorry about that.
So probably what makes the hydrology of the Deschutes Basin so unique is that combination of how much water that we get in the Cascades and then the geology. And I think several of you spoke to that earlier in the presentation. We have these really young volcanic clastic deposits, volcanically derived sediments. And they are along the Cascades and the ancestral Cascades, and they've filled the basin, and they are extremely permeable. And permeability refers to how easily water moves through the ground, how easily it infiltrates, if you will. And so where we're getting this massive amount of precipitation, it's falling on this landscape that is extremely permeable, and so that water is just going into the ground. And so when you reflect back on that stream network map that we showed earlier, that's one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of streams, because the water, most of the water is not running off at all. It's just going right into the ground. And the other feature that's important in the Deschutes is that along the northeastern side and also the northern part of the basin, we have older volcanics that have been weathered, and they are much, much less permeable. So all this water that's infiltrating into the ground is traveling along eastward and northward, and eventually it encounters this less permeable bedrock, and also it thins out. That's the other key feature. So the deposits thin as we go eastward, and they thin out and basically disappear. And so where that happens, what you get is a lot of groundwater comes to the surface, and we'll show this in a second.
And we did have one other question from the audience.
So when the snow melts, the rain runs off, and it enters the ground, when does it impact the aquifer? How many years before we'll see the rise in the aquifer levels at the 500 feet that most of the water level is at now?
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, how long after a runoff or rain event will we see the impacts in the aquifer?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it depends basically how close you are to the recharge area, right? And so, and just one point of clarification. So when we get rainfall and when we get snow melt, we're talking about water that isn't running off, right? We do get runoff. The runoff we see fairly rapidly, and again, some of the tributaries do exhibit this, but most of them don't. But most of the water is actually bypassing the stream network. It's not running off at all. It's going, as you said, into the aquifer. And then the question of like, how long does it take till we start to see a response is a very good one. And it really, and I'll show you a couple slides here in a moment that kind of speak to that. But it really kind of depends on how close you are to the recharge area.
Let's talk about Tumalo. I live in Tumalo. A number of wells are going dry in Tumalo. When that water that enters in at Little Lava Lake, or this Little Deschutes, or the main Deschutes that runs into the Pine, before I start seeing a rise in aquifer or a stabilization of the aquifer underneath my house.
And I mean, I don't know where your specific well is located. I mean, this is kind of a high level talk, so we can talk in generalities. But I mean, there's a lot of things that affect dry wells. How deep that the well actually penetrates the aquifer. A lot of times, wells are only drilled until they hit water, and so they're just at the top end of the aquifer. And so when the aquifer drops, they go dry, and that's a pretty common occurrence. But we can talk about some of the response to climate in general terms, but we're going to have an additional talk that speaks directly to groundwater, and I think that that's one that you should attend to.
Yeah, Paula.
If you could just give us a little bit of scale or perspective on this map where you're seeing these transitions of the older and less permeable, as far as landmarks that we can identify with.
That's a perfect segue to our next our next slide here. So yeah, we have this black line. So put that in your brain for a second, and then we're gonna go to the next slide.
Right. So.
Sorry.
Oh.
If we get a question, can you just mention it? The people online, we don't have.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. So there was a question about wanting some more specifics in terms of landmarks in the base. Going back to our previous slide, of where exactly like the older, less permeable geology butts up against the younger, more permeable geology. And so the response to that question is coming up in the next slide, and the black line on the screen is a cross section that we're going to show in this next slide that Jonathan's going to talk about.
Right. So this is a cross section of that we were looking, the bird's eye view of the basin. And so that black line represents like if we were taking a cake and we're cutting through it and then putting it on it, looking at the profile view of it. And the result of everything that we just talked about, right, the high precipitation in the Cascades, the permeable volcanics, and the thinning of that sequence as you go northward results in this, and that is we have basically a regional groundwater system. And the regional groundwater system, the water table is actually quite close to land surface in parts of the headwaters like Fall River, Lapine area. And as a consequence, you get a lot of groundwater discharging to the streams along that upper area. But a sizable portion of that water infiltrates into the ground and flows tens of miles down to the Lake Billy Chinook area, the lower reaches of the Deschutes, the lower reaches of the Crooked. So like if you ever drive over the Crooked River Gorge, the dramatic bridge there, and look down, as that gorge kind of turns northward, if you actually were able to get down there, you'd start to see water starting to gush in along sides of the canyon walls. And that's actually where, in that particular area where the canyon has incised down to the water table, and what this represents is where the actual Deschutes formation is the main aquifer, where it thins out and abuts the Pelton Round Butte area. And so as a consequence, we have like two groundwater discharge areas. One is along the base of the Cascades, and the other one is down near the Lake Billy Chinook area, in the lower reaches of the Crooked, the Metolius, and the Deschutes.
All right.
Oh, and I'm sorry, there's other things, I guess. And that also speaks, remember we were talking about the hydrograph and the uniformity of flow. Well, one of the reasons that we don't have this flashy system is because of this, right? It takes time. That was like one of your questions, right? How long does it take? Well, it takes time for the groundwater system to kind of transmit that recharge pulse to the stream network, and it happens more quickly at the on the upper reaches than it does the lower reaches. But you do see the response even in the lower reaches. You do see the response of like these wet and dry cycles, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did, yeah. So I just moved here recently from California, and down there, when we look at groundwater, we have several layers of aquifers, maybe four, maybe two. But here with the volcanic landscape, I mean, are you mainly, does it operate more uniformly, or do you still characterize it as like an upper lower aquifer? I know there's pockets of like extreme heterogeneity in the volcanic system, but how do you think about that?
So I'm going to repeat the question for the audience at home. If I'm going to be able to do this, in California there are different. It sounds like there are different layers of aquifers, or sometimes multiple aquifers in this one region. And the question was like whether or not that is similar here in the Deschutes Basin as well. Do we have multiple aquifers, or is it one? Or are there multiple layers?
Yeah, and for the most part, again, generally speaking, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity just mean that, there's lots of variability, right? But it is more of a regional system. We do have areas where we have shallow groundwater, like west of Sisters, and you can get like semi-perched areas where there's canal leakage. You might have more shallow groundwater. But for the most part, we don't have that. But we do elsewhere in Oregon. I mean, having multiple water-bearing zones isn't that uncommon, like, in the Hood Basin and elsewhere in Oregon. It's not that uncommon, like the Willamette as well. But this is definitely more of a regional groundwater system.
All right. So given the geology in the area, can we talk a little bit about how groundwater and surface water are connected?
Right. So this gets a little bit to the question that you had about response, like how long does it take for the groundwater system to respond? And I wish I would have included one more graph in this, but I didn't want to overload you guys with graphs and whatnot. I have a hydrograph, or I should say we've taken a hydrograph from a study by Marshall Gannett and others in 2001, and he was one of the scientists with the USGS, along with Ken Light from our department, that headed a lot of these studies. So this is a graph from that report. And the black line, the upper black line you see, that is the stream flow measured in the Fall River. And again, that's up near Lapine. It's actually mislocated on this map, so apologies for that. But it is tributary to the Deschutes. It is a spring-fed system like most of the tributaries are, and it responds to basically the 5-year precipitation cycle. So not only what's going on this year, but it's also what's going on, how much water we're getting falling in the basin the previous 5 years, all of those integrated. And if I plotted that, and I wish I would have, because it follows that black line almost exactly. The other hydrograph, the light gray line, is water levels in a groundwater well tens of miles to the north near Sisters, and it shows that same signal, right? So both stream flow and groundwater responding to the climate signal. This is close enough to the Cascades that we're not seeing effects from, groundwater pumping or canals or anything like that. This is just what the climate is doing. And so this kind of shows the connection between groundwater and surface water. And it also shows that if you're going to pump groundwater, like eventually you will affect surface water in some place. There's no free lunches, right? There's no kind of groundwater resource that is untapped that we can rely on. They're really interconnected. And a lot of times, again, that's what we mean by water resources, right? We actually mean both. We're talking about surface water and groundwater. And then the photograph, I was talking about the springs coming out of the side of the wall in the lower Crooked. And this is a photo from that, again, taken from Gannett and others. And I've actually floated that stretch, and there's all kinds of places where water is gushing out of the side of the walls. It's pretty impressive. And a matter of fact, the flow between the Crooked above the Crooked River at Smith Rocks, if you've ever been there, it's really quite low. It's usually... there's just not a lot of water there. If you went down below all these springs, you'll see a river that has more water than the Deschutes does above Lake Billy Chinook. And that's all from springs.
All right. Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about how the climate is affecting the hydrology of the area, because that, I'm sure, is on most people's minds in the room and at home. Don't want to leave you guys out.
Right. So this again is the Fall River. This is the mean annual flow that, again, we have a stream gauge up there. Our department operates over 60 stream gauges in the basin. It's one of the most heavily gauged basins in Oregon. A lot of that's used for water management, and a lot of it's used for scientific purposes. Fall River, again, is a great indicator of climate, of the integrated effects of precipitation and temperature. And again, if I would have plotted the precipitation trend over top of this, it would have looked plotted almost on top of it. But what you see, and this is actually pretty common throughout Oregon, is that we have a wet period in the 1950s, and then kind of a drying trend to the present. And along that trend, we have these cycles, these wet cycles and dry cycles, and usually there's sequences of 3 to 4 years where we have successive droughts, and then we'll have successive wet periods. And you see that response in the Fall River, these cycles of wet periods and dry periods. The last sequence of wet period that we had was in the late 1990s. I remember that because my mom's house flooded in 1997. And then since about 2000 onward, we really haven't we've had single wet years, like 2017, Snowmageddon. If you lived here in Bend, we had lots of roof collapses and whatnot. It was a single year. 2011 was similar. 2008, I believe, 2006. We've had like single years, and interspersed among those years, we've had below average or even dry years. And so we don't see that cycle come back up. And you can see the last 3 years have been remarkably dry, notwithstanding the wet spring that we've had. We're still in drought conditions, and it's reflected in the stream flow of the Fall River. So again, the overall trend is actually pretty common. You see this throughout Oregon on streams and on groundwater levels that aren't affected by pumping and whatnot, and then these wet and dry cycles in the last 20 years, really since about 2000, we just haven't had this wet period.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone again that Fall River is a tributary to the upper Deschutes, so
Right.
above Bend, close to the Cascades. It's actually, if you haven't been there yet, it's a good place to go check out. You can literally see the water bubbling out of the ground and at the headwaters of the Fall River. So, yeah. All right. So, talking a little bit more about climate trends here.
Right, and so this is groundwater levels. It's on a well. It's one of our many monitoring wells that we have throughout the basin. It's west of Redmond, and it shows, like closer to Sisters, it shows those same wet periods and dry periods that I was talking about in the Fall River. The period of record doesn't go as far as back as the Fall River to the late 1930s. But again, you see that same kind of wet periods and dry periods, and then from about 2000 onward, we just haven't had those wet periods, and so we don't see like this recovery up. And then the last 3 years have been pretty dismal, and you see that in the decline, both in stream flow and groundwater levels. So that's basically the trend of what we've been seeing. And your question about like when do you see the recharge effects start to affect groundwater levels? So the further east we go, the more muted the response gets. And so there's parts, these wet cycles, there's parts of the basin that still haven't responded to that.
So we got a follow-up question, and we have a microphone now, so I don't have to summarize. Yeah. Jacob's here with the microphone. Thank you, Jacob.
Yes, sir. Okay, so I've lived here since 73.
Get it closer to your mouth if you could.
I've lived here since 73, and one thing I've noticed is in the Tumalo area, this is the original wells for the homesteaders were hand-dug wells. There's actually one just on the homestead next to me that is 35 to 40 foot deep. Back in the 60s, we started drilling wells. They went to 450. Wow. I drilled my well in 2002. I went to 600.
Wow.
The wells today that are being drilled in my neighborhood, which we have an astronomical number of wells going dry, is the way they refer to it, are now down 700 to 750 feet to obtain water. Does that reflect on your graph what I'm seeing from, say, 1910, is when this homestead originally came to Tumalo? Are you saying that this, since 1910, we've been seeing a decline in the aquifer? Or is that...
Well, I guess one, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, but we don't have water level elevations that go back that far. But and this kind of maybe speaks to the question that you raised about multiple aquifers. So if you're digging a well next to the Deschutes River, and I actually grew up in Tumalo along the Deschutes River, actually moved there in 1973. So, and our well was our well was 40 feet deep, and we were basically drinking river water. Yeah. So, I mean, the alluvium in that area, there's a shallow aquifer in the Tumalo area, and wells that are going deeper than that aren't in the alluvium anymore. And really, like I said, we were drinking river water, and it probably wasn't all that high quality. Maybe it was back then. I don't know.
You're still here.
Might explain a lot. might explain why I don't have a PhD like Lisa. So anyway, Tumalo area is an area where there is an alluvial aquifer, and that's distinct. But the deeper wells that you're talking about, I mean, I don't know specifically like what the decline would be in that area, but we have seen declines in the monitoring wells that, again, the further that we get east of the basin, the more pronounced that is. usually like on a regional level, you know, it's approaching about 50 feet. But I'd like to wait. I think you should come to one of the follow-up seminars where we talk exclusively about groundwater, and then we'll have some hydrogeologists, so some guys with a little bit stronger background in geology that can speak to some of your questions.
But wouldn't you address the number of deep wells pulling a hell of a lot of water out of that aquifer?
That's a great question. So we'll touch on that.
Yes, we will touch on that. We can talk about that. And then we have another question up front.
I was going to ask something similar. I mean, you've been tying the decline in groundwater levels to precipitation patterns. I'm wondering what the sense of the human impact on that, because I know there's been a huge population boom.
Yeah, that's again, that's a good question. There was a study published in 2013 that looked at groundwater declines, and maybe you're familiar with it. You seem to be pretty in tune, but you know, that looked at groundwater declines in the basin, and it depends on what area that you're in. But generally speaking, they attributed 60 to 70% of it to climate. 20 to 30% to pumping, groundwater pumping, and I think another 10% to canal lining. And you know, the study needs to be updated, but it also varied by where you are, right? And again, like the closer you get to the Cascades, the more like responsive the wells are, the groundwater system is to climate exclusively or more exclusively. Yeah. So, all right. Are we ready? Okay.
We're going to switch gears a tiny bit and talk a little bit high level about water management and sort of how we ended up where we are with water management. And this is really just a little bit of a teaser, because the next talk is really going to jump into water rights and get a lot more into the weeds about that stuff, which is all very important. And I encourage you all to come. But I'm going to kind of give you a little overview of kind of how we ended up where we are today. Several hundred years ago, the federal government very, very strongly promoted development and moving to the west. And a lot of you may have heard of the Carey Act, which was passed in, I believe it was 1894, essentially saying, like, come west. If you come west and you claim a piece of land and you take that land and you take the water from the rivers and you make the land productive by spreading the water across the landscape to grow crops or feed animals or do something productive, that land becomes yours. And so essentially a lot of people did that. A lot of people moved west to claim parcels of land up to 160 acres, and a lot of land ownership to this day actually still reflects that, 160 acre parcel chunks around the west. And at that time, there was just this perception among the settlers coming to the area that there was limitless resources. You know, I mean, I feel like nobody came here with malice. Everybody came here like seeking a new life and really just thinking that the forests were endless and the rivers were endless, and you know, we just really excited to start a new life and to grow things and to raise their families, much like what, you know, everybody's doing today. But that has had pretty drastic, you know, impacts on our landscape today. We are still living that legacy in 2022. Yeah, by the early 1900s, most of the water, at least in the Deschutes Basin, and I would guess in lots of basins across the West, had already been appropriated. And I don't know if you are familiar with that term, but essentially that means that the states gave out water rights associated with parcels of land. Like, so if you came here and you dug your canal from the river and you irrigated your plot of land, and you then got a water right that had a date on it, and that date basically gave you a priority in where you could use the water, in what order. And by the early 1900s, they had already given away more rights than the natural flow that existed in the rivers, right? So they'd already issued more certificates, which posed a problem for folks, right, who wanted to come and settle here. So unsurprisingly, I'm going to skip ahead really quickly. This is probably a no-brainer, but at this point in the talk, but does anybody know, like, which group of folks has the most of the water rights in the Deschutes Basin, and I will say across the West? Agriculture, yes. So we've got our little bar chart, or our that's not a bar chart. Pie chart, thank you.
Yeah.
Our pie chart here that shows in the Deschutes Basin, 86% of the water rights are going towards agriculture, compared with 2%, and then that 12% that we call in-stream. That's basically the water that gets left in the river. And this is an interesting thing to note, is that going back to the 1900s, when they were giving away water to folks who were going to use the water beneficially on their lands to do productive things with it, the rivers got completely left out of the equation. I mean, there was no legal precedent for leaving water in the stream. It was all about putting the water to use and the land to use to do productive things. So it really wasn't until 1987, actually, in the state of Oregon, that rivers basically could have a right to have water in them themselves. And so that 12% is the water rights that have been returned to the stream at this point. So water rights that have been retired from agriculture and other uses and are in stream. So this is the lay of the land of who has the water rights in the Deschutes Basin. And I would say that this looks very similar across the entire western United States, except for probably not as big of a wedge for the in-stream interest, probably a much smaller wedge in other basins in other parts of the West. Yes, we have a question in the audience, and they're coming around with a mic.
Do golf courses fall into the municipal category?
Generally speaking, they do. Yes, municipal and quasi-municipal uses. Yeah, and that's always a big shocker for folks, because I hear that. That's probably my favorite myth buster in water world, is to just let people know that, believe it or not, golf courses and breweries are not responsible for using all the water in Central Oregon. But I hear it all the time, and it makes really good sense. I mean, you're in a desert and you see this amazingly beautiful golf course and you think, what the heck? But no, they're in that 2% slice there.
The only thing that I would maybe add is that having the basin over allocated, which occurred actually in the early 1900s, that wasn't that unusual, right? In Oregon, it wasn't that unusual. One of the reasons it wasn't, Lisa talked about, putting the water to work and settlement, encouraging settlement, but also we just didn't know a lot about how much water there was.
Right. Yes.
Tumalo Creek, for example, the estimated flow of it was 5 times what it actually is, or they thought it was 5 times. And it's kind of like what's happening with the Colorado as well, right? Although they had some information, they actually collected information during a wet period, and now we have a much drier climate. So at any rate, it's not that unusual. And the state, my department, actually its predecessor was the state engineer's office. And the thinking back then was that, well, the water master, the person that's in charge of distributing water, they'll just go out and they'll turn off the most junior users. They'll regulate them. And that still happens to this day. And some places it happens to water rights that are as old as 1880. So I know areas like outside of the Dalles where the water rights are, unless you have a water right where you basically establish that you were using the water in the 1880s, you will be regulated off for that more senior right. And shortages aren't shared either. It's either if you have a junior right, you're off, and then the next person gets his full amount. So shortages aren't shared. And this is just the nature of the prior appropriation doctrine, which is the basis of Oregon water law, and it's also the basis of Western water law.
Yeah. And we will get into much more depth of prior appropriation in the next talk, but I like your little teasers there. Yeah, we have another question in the audience.
So if you were to overlay stream flows over this, how over allocated does this rights chart end up?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't know exactly about overlaying stream flow, but we do have a pretty good idea of where the demands are and how much demands there are in certain areas, like in the in-stream category and the municipal category and the agricultural category. And there are needs in all of those categories. I feel like yes, we do know how much. Yeah. So like, for instance, I can throw out a number here, but I don't know how much the numbers will mean anything to anyone, but For instance, the cities anticipate that they need, I believe, 16,000 acre feet to meet the demands of the next 50 years. So that's one of the numbers.
Does everyone know what an acre foot is? Right. It's basically an acre. You can imagine like a football field covered with 1 foot of water. That's basically an acre foot of water. So city of Bend, or was it Bend? I think it's all municipal use.
It's all municipal uses in
Yeah, it's
Central
about
Oregon,
16,000, which
Yeah.
sounds like a lot, but actually in the grand scheme of
Yeah.
thing, the agricultural demand is like 700,000 acre feet. So it puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
And again, the pie chart actually puts it in perspective as well.
And the way for the cities and other interests to be able to acquire new water is going to be retiring of existing water rights. Because again, the basin is over allocated and there's no new water to be found. And there's also a very large need in the in-stream category, which we're going to get to talking about in just a second here.
Yeah, there's so much to cover. I mean,
I know, we
that
could be
we're
up here
that
all
we're not
week.
going to cover because like it's not part of. But I mean, you guys are asking like these great questions. You're already in tune with like what the issues are, and we're just kind of giving you this overview. But there will be other seminars that kind of speak to a lot of these. So I encourage you to keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say I was looking at people looking at the collaborative brochures, and there's I think a second pie chart in there that shows the demands. I believe it shows that out of the unmet demands, in-stream demand is 80% of the unmet demand in an average year. So that might help answer your question, and we'll go more into that in future seminars.
Yes, we will.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have another question here if you want to pass the mic.
How do we get these rights? The rights expire? Do they have a date? I'm not an ag owner.
Such a good question, and I'm going to jump into probably Kyle's territory for the next talk.
Is it also developers?
So it's water rights are like on the basis of prior appropriation, which became law in Oregon in 1909. And so basically, the first people to put the water to use got that water right. So if you were out there and you started irrigating in 1900, you got a water right that was stamped 1900, and that water right transfers with the land. So the next person to buy that land gets that water right. And so essentially, as long as you continue to use that water right at least once every 5 years, that water right stays tied to that land. So when it comes to getting new water rights, it is actually very interesting and challenging, and we're going to have an entire seminar where we talk about what we call groundwater mitigation, which is the cities looking for new water, and in order to get new water, water needs to be able to be put back in stream, and that's because of the interconnectedness between groundwater and surface water that Jonathan has explained this evening. And so, so to get new water rights, essentially old water rights need to be retired to enable that to happen. So, all right, and Kate's going to add something because she.
Oh no, I'm not. Well, we also to put water back in stream, we are able to do different. We have tools where we can lease or buy or take advantage of saved water and get that senior priority date. And we'll have 2 or 3 different seminars about those tools.
Yeah.
I'm just doing a little time check that we're about an hour in.
Okay.
So maybe 5. I think you're close to the end, but 5 or 10 minutes to wrap up.
I know. We could keep talking all night,
I
but
know,
we won't.
I know. It's great. And
but I love the
sense
questions.
that your audience is interested. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's any huge rush, but just to respect people's time.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for the time check, because I've been looking for a clock and there is not one on the wall and there's no way to know. So, so I'm gonna sort of speed up a little bit in an effort to kind of cover a few more things before we call it a night. So I just wanted to show you this map. This is a map of the Deschutes Basin has 8 irrigation districts. And again, going back to the previous slide with the 86% of the water rights distributed to irrigation in the basin, the irrigators, all the different irrigation districts are represented by different colors on this map. And essentially what happened in terms of the priority date is that the areas closer to Bend were settled first. And those irrigation districts then, starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they acquired early water rights, essentially that represented all of the natural flow in the Deschutes River. So by 1913, when folks were trying to settle up near Madras, which is like the purpley pink area up in the top of the slide, there was no more water, live flow in the river. Like it didn't exist. So in order for those folks to be able to have water to irrigate crops, they had to store water in the form of a reservoir. And so eventually Crane Prairie and Wickiup Reservoir, which are at the bottom of the slide, which are in the upper Deschutes, were constructed to hold water back. And this is where we start to see major changes in the Deschutes River, the impacts of that. So you guys all remember the hydrograph of the natural stable flowing of the Deschutes River? Well, once we built a dam and we started moving water specifically for the purposes of irrigation, which we have done for well over 100 years, this is the regulated hydrograph that's overlaid the natural hydrograph. So what's happened is you see that, in November, December, January, February, we're storing water in Wickiup Reservoir so that we can meet irrigation demands that occur in the summer months. So effectively that's turning down the spigot of the river up near the headwaters of the Deschutes River. And then come irrigation season in March and April and May, they start to release water, and the river then carries a much larger flow than what it naturally carried prior to us starting to regulate the river. So, and this has had really profound impacts on our river. I'm not going to go through all this. This is in your handout as well, but this is just another schematic to show you that, there's reduced flows in the wintertime right below Wickiup Dam. And then in the summertime, you have the increased flows at Wickiup and then reduced flows at Bend. And the reason why you have reduced flows at Bend at what we consider the middle Deschutes is because that is where most of the major irrigation diversions happen. So right below Bend, like right above where the river house is, if you guys have ever been to the river house, that is where essentially most of the irrigation districts have their huge diversions, and then that water goes into a canal and travels for tens of miles to meet irrigation demands on farms. So it has had drastic impacts on our hydrograph. I'm going to skip the next slide. Oh, no, I'm not going to skip this one. So this is a picture of the impacts of what that completely altered and regulated hydrograph. The upper left-hand corner is the Middle Deschutes River in Bend. And I believe that picture predates any of the work that the Deschutes River Conservancy and its partners has done over the last several decades of putting water back in streams. But essentially, up until a handful of years ago, we almost completely dewatered that stretch of river. So right below Bend, there was almost no water in that river. And then the other two photos on the right-hand side and at the bottom are pictures of what the river looks like right below Wickiup Dam in the wintertime. So effectively when they're storing water for the irrigation season. So you can see a high and dry dock that gets water in the summertime, and you can actually see Wickiup Dam in the back of the picture on the bottom. So this has had really, obviously, lasting impacts on fish and wildlife. In 2014, the Oregon spotted frog was listed as a threatened species in Oregon, and they exist in this part of the river in the upper Deschutes. Native red band trout are also really impacted. Really, all the species are impacted. You can't dry up sections of river and not have them be impacted. So there have been lasting impacts. But there have also been a lot of really dedicated, smart people working hard to seek solutions to this. And that's kind of where our work comes in, and where the next many seminars are going to talk about the projects and programs that are in place and that we are continuing to grow and that we're trying to teach folks about, so you all can help support these projects and programs to help resolve some of these issues. So I just want to throw this up as like the good news. So this is the flow restoration that has occurred in the Deschutes River, and you don't have to worry about the different colors. You can just know that each of the different colors on the graph denotes a different tool in our toolkit. So like a different project or a different program that the Deschutes River Conservancy and our partners are working on to actually put water back in streams and help resolve some of these issues. And we're also, I will say that we were working hand in hand with all of the agriculturalists as well. Our partners are very much the irrigation districts, and we're really looking to try to make irrigation districts more efficient. And effectively, they've been using the same infrastructure that were hand-dug canals in that porous volcanic landscape like over 100 years ago, and we're still using that same infrastructure today. So there's great opportunities out there for efficiency, and with that efficiency, that water then can be moved to other uses, like putting it back in stream for fish and wildlife, transferring it to other agriculturalists in other parts of the basin who have water rights, like Jonathan talked about, that get regulated off basically they get turned off and they don't get water. So yeah, so that is what we are about. And I'm just a few pictures. We have increased the flows in the Middle Deschutes fourfold since the DRC's inception. Deschutes Creek in Sisters in the summertime used to run completely dry 2 out of every 3 years, and now it's a free-flowing stream that's approaching meeting state water goals. So we have had progress, and and we couldn't do it without our partners like the Oregon Water Resource Department and the irrigation districts and others. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, here's a plug for the next series of seminars. So yeah, thank you so much for being our guinea pigs and being here tonight, and for being such a great audience and asking so many great questions. And yeah, we hope that you will continue to come and learn. So thank you.
I just wanted to thank everybody. I'm off screen, but also, like, we really do want your feedback. So those comment cards on your table, don't be shy to tell any of us, and we hope to see you again, and also give your input on other topics you'd like to see us cover. Thank you again.
Yes, please let us know what you'd like to hear about. That's actually would be really informative, because although we have topics sort of laid out for the foreseeable future, we're super interested to know what you all are interested in and what you're concerned about, and what we can help you inform you about. And that goes for the people at home too. We would really love it. I believe there's a Survey Monkey that's going to go out, if it hasn't gone out already, that is the equivalent of an online comment card. And we hope that you all will fill that out and let us know both what you're interested in learning about and what worked about this seminar and what didn't. And we thank you all for the patience as we play with this with this newfound seminar series.
You had great questions, by the way. So I recommend that you follow up with, because I think some of the questions that maybe we didn't get to will be answered in some of the follow-up. Some of the, especially related to the next talk is on water rights. Is that right? Yep. Kyle Gorman, who I work with out of the Bend office, has extensive knowledge of water rights. And anyway, yeah, these are great questions, and it's great to see you guys here and getting plugged into water issues.
Thank you for being here, Jonathan. Appreciate you.
You and me.